The courtroom smelled like old paper and floor polish, and I remember thinking, as I sat in that hard wooden chair with my cane resting against my knee, that this was the room where a man who hadn't seen his daughter in 3 years was about to tell a judge that I wasn't fit to raise her. Marcus sat across the aisle in a gray suit that looked new, his lawyer leaning over to whisper something that made him nod with the particular confidence of a man who believed, completely, that he held the moral high ground in this room. "Your Honor," his attorney began, "my client is simply seeking what's in the best interest of the child. Given the mother's ongoing physical limitations following her accident, we believe." I felt my own attorney, Diane Foster, place a steady hand briefly on my arm, a small gesture that said, "Wait, let him finish, we'll have our turn." I waited. I had gotten very good, over the past 3 years, at waiting through things that felt unbearable. But before I tell you what happened in that courtroom, I need to take you back. Because the man sitting across that aisle, the one whose lawyer was using my physical limitations as evidence against me, had been the one who walked out the exact week those limitations began. My name is Rachel. 5 years ago, I was 31 years old, 8 months pregnant with our daughter, Emma, and driving home from a baby shower thrown by my sister when a truck ran a red light and hit my car on the driver's side at 45 miles an hour. I don't remember the impact itself. What I remember is waking up in a hospital bed 4 days later, my husband Marcus sitting beside me with an expression I couldn't quite read, and the first words out of his mouth being, "The baby's fine." They had to deliver her early, but she's fine. Emma had been delivered by emergency cesarean while I was unconscious, 6 weeks premature but, miraculously, healthy. I wouldn't actually hold my daughter for the first time until 9 days after she was born, because my own injuries required more immediate attention than anyone initially understood. The accident had caused severe spinal trauma. 2 vertebrae fractured, significant nerve damage in my lower spine, and what the doctors initially described, in the careful, measured language of medical professionals delivering devastating news, as uncertain prognosis regarding ambulatory function. In plain language, they didn't know if I would ever walk again. I spent the first 6 weeks after the accident in the hospital, then a rehabilitation facility, doing the kind of physical therapy that nobody adequately prepares you for, work that left me exhausted and in tears most days, learning to do things my body had previously done without thought, relearning balance, relearning the most basic mechanics of movement, while simultaneously trying to bond with a newborn daughter I'd barely had the chance to hold before everything fell apart. Marcus visited during those first weeks. I want to be fair about that, because I think the full picture matters. He came to the hospital, brought Emma to visit when the rehabilitation facility allowed it, sat with me during some of the genuinely terrifying early conversations with my medical team about what my recovery might actually look like. But I noticed, even in those early weeks, a particular quality to his presence that I initially attributed to shock, to the trauma of nearly losing both his wife and daughter in the same catastrophic event. He seemed distant during visits. He answered my questions about how he was managing at home, about how he was handling having a newborn essentially alone, with short, deflecting responses that didn't invite further conversation. "I'm managing," he'd say. "We're fine. Just focus on getting better." I told myself this was simply how Marcus processed stress, retreating into stoic self-sufficiency rather than openly discussing his own fear and exhaustion. I had 3 years of marriage with him before the accident, and emotional withdrawal during crisis had always been a pattern, one I'd learned to navigate by giving him space rather than pushing for the kind of vulnerable conversation that seemed to make him visibly uncomfortable. What I didn't fully understand, during those first 6 weeks, was that Marcus wasn't simply struggling silently while remaining fundamentally committed to weathering this crisis alongside me. He was making a decision, gradually, about whether he actually wanted to remain married to a woman whose physical future was, at that point, genuinely uncertain. The moment I understood this with complete clarity arrived during my 2nd month in rehabilitation, on a Tuesday afternoon that I remember with the particular vivid precision that trauma sometimes burns into memory. I had just finished a grueling physical therapy session, the kind that left my entire body trembling with exhaustion, attempting to take my first unassisted steps using parallel bars while my therapist hovered close enough to catch me if my legs gave out, which they did, twice, before I managed 3 full steps on the 3rd attempt. I was exhilarated despite the exhaustion, genuinely proud of progress that, just weeks earlier, doctors had suggested might not be possible at all. I called Marcus immediately, eager to share this milestone with him. I took 3 steps today, I told him, my voice carrying genuine excitement despite my physical exhaustion. Unassisted. The therapist says if I keep progressing like this, we might be looking at a walker within a month, maybe even a cane eventually instead of the wheelchair. There was a long pause on the line, longer than felt natural for someone receiving genuinely good news about his wife's recovery. That's good, Marcus finally said, his voice carrying a flatness that didn't match the words. That's really good, Rachel. You don't sound excited, I said, confusion creeping into my voice. Another pause. I am excited. I'm tired. Emma was up most of the night, and I've got work in the morning. I accepted this explanation, attributing his flat effect to exhaustion rather than anything more concerning. It would be another 2 weeks before I understood that this phone call had actually been the beginning of the end, the moment when Marcus had apparently decided that even good news about my recovery wasn't enough to change a decision he was already making. He stopped visiting as frequently after that conversation. His excuses started accumulating: work demands, Emma's unpredictable newborn schedule, exhaustion that prevented the drive to the rehabilitation facility. I attributed all of this, initially, to the genuine, overwhelming stress of single-handedly caring for a newborn while his wife remained hospitalized, a kindness of interpretation that I extended for far longer than the actual evidence probably warranted. The conversation that finally revealed the truth happened during my 3rd month in rehabilitation, the week I was scheduled to be discharged home, finally able to navigate with a walker. Still requiring significant physical therapy but stable enough that my medical team felt confident releasing me to continue recovery at home. I called Marcus to coordinate the discharge logistics, expecting to discuss timing for him to pick me up, what accommodations we'd need to make at home for my continued mobility limitations. Rachel, he said, before I could even finish explaining the discharge details, I need to tell you something, and I need you to actually hear me out before you react. Something in his tone made my stomach drop even before he continued. I don't think I can do this, he said. I don't think I can be married to someone who might never walk again, who might need this level of care indefinitely. I know that sounds horrible. I know it makes me sound like a terrible person. But I've been thinking about this for weeks, and I can't see myself living the rest of my life like this. I sat in that rehabilitation facility room, holding the phone, processing words that fundamentally rewrote everything I'd believed about my marriage, about the man who'd promised, 3 years earlier, to be with me through whatever came. Marcus, I said, my voice carrying a calm that masked the genuine panic building underneath, I'm being discharged this week. I need to know what our plan is, for me coming home, for taking care of Emma. I think, he said, his voice carrying the particular careful neutrality of someone who had clearly rehearsed this conversation, that you should stay with your sister for a while, until you're more stable. I can bring Emma to visit. But I don't think I can be your primary caregiver right now, and I think it's better for everyone if we're honest about that rather than pretending I can handle something I can't. What he was actually saying, beneath the careful language about honesty and capacity, was that he was leaving. Not gradually, not after some transition period of working through this crisis together, but immediately, the exact week I was being discharged from rehabilitation with a newborn who needed full-time care and a body that still required walkers, physical therapy, and ongoing medical support. You're abandoning us, I said, the words feeling both obvious and somehow impossible to fully process even as I spoke them. I'm not abandoning anyone, Marcus said, his voice carrying defensive certainty. I'll still be involved. I'll still see Emma regularly. I just can't be your husband anymore, not under these circumstances. That's not abandonment, Rachel. That's just being honest about my limitations. I would spend years afterward thinking about that particular framing, his limitations, as though his decision to leave his disabled wife and infant daughter during the most vulnerable period of their lives was a personal challenge he was navigating with admirable honesty, rather than what it actually was. He moved out of our apartment within 2 weeks. He filed for divorce 4 months later, requesting minimal custody arrangements that, at the time, felt like one small mercy amid an otherwise devastating situation: visitation every other weekend, no request for primary custody, no ongoing fight about Emma's day-to-day care. I moved in with my sister, as Marcus had suggested, not because I accepted his framing of the situation, but because I genuinely needed support navigating early motherhood while continuing intensive physical therapy and rebuilding both my mobility and my entire understanding of what my life would actually look like going forward. I had no idea, sitting in that rehabilitation facility room 3 years before that courtroom confrontation, that the man who just abandoned his disabled wife and newborn daughter would eventually return, fully recovered from whatever crisis of conscience had driven him away, demanding custody of the child he'd left behind. The first 6 months living at my sister's house were, without question, the hardest of my entire life, harder even than the accident itself, because the accident had been a single catastrophic event while those 6 months were a daily, grinding confrontation with everything I'd lost and everything I still needed to rebuild. My sister, Jennifer, had 2 children of her own, ages 7 and 9, and a husband, Mark, who worked long hours as a contractor. She converted her home office into a bedroom for Emma and me, and for those first months, I existed in a state of exhaustion so complete that I sometimes struggled to remember entire days, the way trauma and sleep deprivation can compress time into an indistinguishable blur. I was still using a walker for most mobility, attending physical therapy 3 times a week, a schedule that required Jennifer to coordinate transportation for both me and Emma, since I couldn't yet drive, couldn't carry my own daughter while managing a walker, couldn't do most of the basic physical tasks that new mothers typically navigate without significant thought. I want to describe what this actually looked like in practice, because I think the texture of daily struggle matters for understanding what came later. Changing Emma's diaper required a complex system Jennifer and I developed together, a changing table at the exact height where I could sit in a chair beside it rather than standing, since standing for extended periods remained difficult and occasionally dangerous given my balance issues. Feeding her required similar accommodation, nursing or bottle feeding from a seated position with careful attention to my own positioning to avoid the back pain that any sudden movement still triggered. Nights were the hardest. Emma, like most infants, woke multiple times for feeding, and the physical mechanics of getting up, navigating to her crib, managing both my own mobility limitations and a crying newborn simultaneously, tested limits of exhaustion and physical capability that I hadn't previously known existed within me. Jennifer helped tremendously during those early months, taking night shifts when she could manage it around her own family's needs, but I was acutely aware, throughout that period, that I was asking my sister to essentially absorb significant caregiving responsibility for a child that wasn't hers, while also managing her own household, because the man who should have been sharing this burden had decided, 3 months into Emma's life, that he simply couldn't do it. I called Marcus during this period more times than I'm proud to admit, not seeking reconciliation, but seeking basic involvement in Emma's care that felt, at minimum, reasonable to expect from her father. "Could you take her for a weekend?" I asked, during one particularly exhausted call about 4 months after he'd moved out. "Just to give me a chance to focus more intensively on physical therapy, maybe get some actual sleep?" "I don't really have the setup for overnight visits yet," Marcus said. "My new apartment isn't really baby-proofed, and honestly, my schedule's pretty demanding right now with the promotion I just got." This pattern repeated itself throughout that first year, Marcus offering reasonable-sounding excuses for limiting his involvement, framing his absence as temporary practical limitations rather than what I increasingly recognized as a fundamental unwillingness to actually participate in the difficult, unglamorous work of caring for an infant during a period when doing so would require navigating around my own physical limitations as well. His visitation, the every other weekend arrangement specified in our divorce agreement, became increasingly inconsistent. He'd cancel citing work obligations, or simply not show up without adequate explanation, leaving me to manage Emma's confused disappointment alongside everything else. I want to be honest about something complicated here, because I think it matters for understanding the full emotional texture of this period. Part of me was almost relieved by his inconsistent involvement, even as another part of me was furious about it on Emma's behalf. The logistics of preparing Emma for visits, then managing her distress when those visits were cancelled, added complexity to days that already felt impossibly full. There was a kind of exhausted simplicity in simply expecting his absence rather than hoping for his presence and repeatedly being disappointed. By the time Emma turned 1, Marcus's involvement had dwindled to occasional, unpredictable visits, sometimes monthly, sometimes with gaps of 2 or 3 months between contact. He remained current on the modest child support payments specified in our agreement, a detail I noted with a kind of bitter clarity. He could manage financial obligation, apparently, even as he abandoned every other dimension of parental responsibility. My own recovery continued throughout that first year, marked by genuine, hard-won progress that I tracked with the meticulous attention of someone who understood exactly how much effort each incremental improvement required. I graduated from the walker to a cane around Emma's first birthday, a milestone that felt, at the time, like one of the most significant achievements of my entire life. I moved into my own apartment when Emma was 14 months old, a small but manageable space that I'd specifically chosen for its accessibility features: ground floor, no stairs, a bathroom configured to accommodate the mobility aids I still required for balance and stability. This move represented genuine independence, the first time since the accident that I was managing both my own care and Emma's without the constant, generous support Jennifer had provided throughout that difficult first year. I returned to work part-time when Emma was 18 months old, a modified version of my previous career as a graphic designer that I could manage from home, gradually building back professional capacity alongside continued physical therapy and the ongoing demands of single parenting. I want to be clear about something. This period, despite its enormous difficulty, was also marked by genuine joy and connection with my daughter that I think gets lost when stories like this focus primarily on hardship. Emma was, by every measure, a happy, securely attached child. She didn't know a version of motherhood that included two fully able-bodied parents, because she'd never experienced that version. What she knew was a mother who, despite using a cane, despite occasional bad days when pain or fatigue limited what we could do, showed up for her completely, consistently, with the kind of presence that mattered more to her developing sense of security than any abstract concept of normal family structure. Marcus's involvement, over the following 2 years, settled into an even more minimal pattern. By Emma's third birthday, he was seeing her perhaps 4 or 5 times a year, brief visits that felt, increasingly, more like performative gestures toward maintaining some legal relationship with his daughter than genuine paternal engagement. I didn't pursue legal action to formalize more consistent visitation or to address his inconsistent involvement, partly because I genuinely didn't have the emotional or financial resources to engage in prolonged legal conflict, and partly because, if I'm honest, his minimal involvement had become a kind of predictable arrangement that, while not ideal, didn't actively destabilize the life Emma and I had built together. I had, by Emma's 4th birthday, achieved a level of physical recovery that exceeded even my most optimistic early predictions. I walked independently most days, using a cane primarily for longer distances or on bad pain days rather than as a constant necessity. I had returned to full-time work. I had built a genuinely stable, happy life for Emma and myself, one that, while different from what I'd originally envisioned for our family, felt complete and sufficient in its own right. I had also, somewhere during those 4 years, started dating again, eventually building a relationship with a man named David, a structural engineer I'd met through a mutual friend, someone who treated both Emma and me with a consistency and genuine care that felt, after years of Marcus's unpredictable absence, almost startling in its reliability. It was David, actually, who first raised the question that would eventually trigger everything that followed. "Has Marcus mentioned anything about wanting more involvement lately?" David asked one evening, about 6 months into our relationship, after Emma had gone to bed. "I noticed he's actually called twice this month, which seems different from the pattern you've described." I hadn't fully registered this shift myself until David pointed it out, but he was right. Marcus's calls had increased in frequency over the previous 2 months, his visits had become slightly more consistent, and during our most recent exchange, he'd asked several questions about Emma's school routine, her friends, details that, frankly, surprised me given his previous level of disengagement. I didn't think much of this shift initially, attributing it perhaps to some genuine, if belated, awakening of paternal interest as Emma grew older and more conversationally engaging. I had no idea, during those months of slightly increased contact, that Marcus was actually gathering information, building a case, preparing for something I wouldn't fully understand until the legal papers arrived at my door on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday afternoon, exactly 3 years and 2 months after he'd told me, in that rehabilitation facility, that he couldn't be married to someone who might never walk again. The papers requested a full custody evaluation, citing concerns about Emma's living environment and my capacity, given what they described as ongoing physical limitations following a serious accident, to provide adequate primary care for a growing child. I sat at my kitchen table that Tuesday afternoon, reading legal language that characterized the body I had spent 4 years rebuilding, the recovery I had fought for through countless hours of physical therapy and sheer determination, as evidence of unfitness to parent the daughter I had raised, almost entirely alone, since the day Marcus walked out of that rehabilitation facility conversation and into a life that apparently, eventually, included deciding he wanted back the role he'd abandoned 3 years earlier. I called Diane Foster 3 days after the custody papers arrived, my hands still slightly unsteady as I dialed, the particular kind of anger that doesn't have an obvious immediate outlet, making concentration on basic tasks unexpectedly difficult. Diane had been recommended by a friend who'd navigated her own complicated custody situation, described to me as a family law attorney with particular experience handling cases involving disability discrimination, a specialty I hadn't even known existed as a distinct legal category until I found myself, apparently, needing exactly that expertise. "I need to understand something immediately," Diane said, during our first consultation, her tone carrying the brisk efficiency of someone who'd clearly handled many initial panicked phone calls from parents facing custody challenges. "Walk me through the actual timeline. When did the accident happen, when did he leave, and what has his involvement looked like since then?" I walked her through everything: the accident, the rehabilitation, his departure during my discharge week, the years of inconsistent, minimal involvement, the recent uptick in contact that, I now understood with uncomfortable clarity, had likely been strategic information gathering rather than genuine paternal reawakening. "Here's what I need you to understand," Diane said, once I'd finished. "Custody disputes that specifically cite a parent's disability as grounds for unfitness face significant legal scrutiny under disability rights law, but that doesn't mean this won't be a difficult, exhausting process. His attorney is going to try to paint a picture of ongoing physical limitation as inherently incompatible with adequate parenting, and our job is going to be demonstrating, comprehensively, exactly how capable and consistent your actual parenting has been, regardless of mobility aids or ongoing physical therapy." "What do you need from me?" I asked. "Everything," Diane said. "Every piece of documentation that demonstrates your daily involvement in Emma's life, your professional stability, your medical recovery trajectory, and critically, every piece of evidence regarding his actual involvement, or lack thereof, over the past 4 years." What followed was a months-long process of assembling documentation that, I came to understand, would essentially construct 2 parallel narratives for the court to evaluate: my consistent, daily presence in Emma's life despite genuine physical challenges, against Marcus's almost complete absence during the years when Emma most needed reliable parental presence. I started with medical records, requesting comprehensive documentation from my entire recovery process: the initial trauma assessment, the rehabilitation progress notes, my physical therapist's evaluations tracking improvement over 4 years, my current physician's assessment of my present functional capacity. My physical therapist, a woman named Carol who had worked with me for 3 years and genuinely understood the trajectory of my recovery, wrote a detailed letter for the court explaining exactly what my current mobility limitations actually meant in practical terms. "Rachel's current functional status allows full independent mobility for all standard daily activities," Carol wrote, in language Diane helped craft to specifically counter the vague, alarmist framing of ongoing physical limitations that Marcus's filing had used. "She utilizes a cane primarily for extended distances or fatigue management, not as an indication of significant functional impairment. Her capacity for childcare-related physical tasks, lifting, carrying, managing a child's daily needs, is fully intact based on our most recent functional capacity evaluation." I gathered school records demonstrating Emma's consistent attendance, her teachers' assessments of her social and emotional development, documentation showing I had attended every parent-teacher conference, every school event, every required medical appointment for Emma throughout her 4 years of life. I compiled financial records demonstrating my professional stability, my consistent income from my graphic design work, the accessible apartment I maintained, evidence that I had built a genuinely sustainable, well-resourced life for both Emma and myself despite the challenges of single parenting through ongoing recovery. The more complicated documentation involved establishing the actual pattern of Marcus's involvement, because while I had a clear personal memory of his inconsistent visits and frequent cancellations, translating that lived experience into the kind of concrete documentation a court would find persuasive required more systematic evidence than my own recollection. "Do you have any written communication with him over the years?" Diane asked. texts, emails, anything that documents the actual pattern of canceled visits or missed commitments. I did, as it turned out, have years of text message exchanges that, once I went back through them systematically, painted an unmistakable pattern. Messages from me confirming upcoming visitation, followed by messages from Marcus canceling, often with minimal notice and increasingly thin explanations. Messages where I'd ask about scheduling consistent visits, met with vague non-commitments. An entire archive of digital evidence I'd never thought to specifically preserve for legal purposes, but that existed, comprehensively, simply because I'd maintained the same phone number and never deleted old conversations. I spent an entire weekend going through 4 years of text messages, organizing them chronologically, flagging specific instances of canceled visits, missed commitments, and the general pattern of declining engagement that characterized Marcus's actual involvement in Emma's life. What emerged from this process was sobering in its clarity. Across 4 years, Marcus had seen Emma, by my count using his own confirmed visits, approximately 31 times total. 31 visits, many lasting only a few hours, across 48 months of his daughter's life. I also requested, through Diane's guidance, formal records from the family court system documenting our original custody arrangement, the visitation schedule he'd specifically requested at the time of our divorce, minimal. Every other weekend visits that he himself had proposed rather than seeking more substantial involvement. This matters, Diane explained, because it directly contradicts any narrative he might try to construct suggesting he wanted more involvement but was somehow prevented from achieving it. The original custody agreement, in his own requested terms, establishes that minimal involvement was his choice from the very beginning. The most emotionally difficult piece of documentation Diane requested involved gathering character witnesses, people who could speak to both my actual parenting and Marcus's actual pattern of involvement, from a position of genuine, direct observation rather than second-hand characterization. Jennifer agreed immediately to provide testimony about those first crucial months, about the actual texture of single parenting through disability recovery that she'd witnessed firsthand, about Marcus's near-complete absence during the period when Emma most desperately needed reliable parental presence. My physical therapist agreed to testify about my actual functional capacity. Emma's preschool teacher agreed to speak to her assessment of Emma's development and our consistent, positive parent-child relationship as observed through years of daily interaction. David, my partner, agreed to testify as well, though Diane cautioned that his testimony would carry less weight given his personal relationship with me, his perspective potentially viewed as inherently biased by the court. I also, during this period, requested a comprehensive functional capacity evaluation from an independent medical professional, someone with no prior relationship to me or my case, specifically to provide objective, court-credible assessment of my actual physical capabilities as they related to parenting capacity. This evaluation, conducted by a physician specializing in disability assessment, concluded definitively that my mobility limitations, while real and ongoing, presented no significant barrier to safe, adequate, consistent parenting of a child Emma's age. The report specifically noted that my use of a cane represented a manageable accommodation rather than a fundamental impairment, and that my 4-year track record of successful single parenting through recovery represented, in the physician's professional assessment, compelling evidence of adaptive capacity rather than limitation. Throughout this entire documentation gathering process, which extended across nearly 5 months as the custody case moved through standard legal scheduling, I maintained Emma's normal routine as consistently as possible, trying to shield her from the stress and uncertainty I was experiencing, even as preparing for this legal battle consumed enormous amounts of my time, energy, and emotional resources. Marcus, during this same period, exercised his standard visitation rights with notably increased consistency, a shift that Diane explained was likely strategic, an attempt to demonstrate, through recent behavior, an engagement pattern that contradicted the years of inconsistency that preceded it. He's trying to build a narrative of a father who's always wanted more involvement but faced obstacles, Diane explained. Our job is making sure the court sees the full 4-year pattern, not just the past few months of strategic, litigation-motivated visits. The court date arrived on a Thursday in October, nearly 5 months after I'd first opened those custody papers at my kitchen table. I had spent those 5 months building, methodically and comprehensively, the most thorough documentation of my life and parenting that I could possibly assemble, working alongside Diane to construct a case that would directly counter every assumption embedded in Marcus's filing about what disability meant for parental capacity. I walked into that courtroom with my cane, my carefully organized binder of documentation, and a clarity about exactly what I needed to demonstrate that felt, after 5 months of preparation, almost like armor against whatever Marcus's attorney intended to argue. I had no idea, sitting in that hard wooden chair waiting for proceedings to begin, exactly how directly his attorney would attempt to weaponize my physical recovery against me, or how completely that strategy would ultimately collapse under the weight of evidence I'd spent 5 months assembling. Marcus's attorney spent the first hour of proceedings building exactly the narrative Diane had predicted, presenting his client as a devoted father who had struggled, throughout the years following my accident, to maintain meaningful involvement in Emma's life due to what he characterized as logistical complications and my own instability during recovery. My client has consistently sought greater involvement in his daughter's life, the attorney argued, but has faced ongoing challenges given the mother's continuing physical limitations and the inherently unstable environment those limitations create for a young, developing child. I watched the judge, a woman named Patricia Hendricks who had presided over family court for nearly 2 decades according to Diane's research, listening to this characterization with an expression I couldn't quite read. Professionally neutral in the way I imagine judges learn to cultivate through years of hearing competing narratives presented as absolute truth. When Diane finally had her opportunity to respond, she began not with emotional appeals, but with the methodical presentation of documentation that I'd spent 5 months helping assemble. "Your Honor," Diane said, "I'd like to address the characterization of my client's physical limitations as creating an unstable environment, because I believe the actual evidence tells a fundamentally different story than what's been presented." She walked through the medical documentation first, my physical therapist's assessment, the independent functional capacity evaluation, my current physician's evaluation of my mobility status. The judge listened carefully, occasionally making notes, her expression remaining carefully neutral even as the evidence began establishing a picture considerably different from the alarming ongoing physical limitations language in Marcus's original filing. "The medical evidence," Diane continued, "establishes that Ms. Chen's mobility limitations represent a manageable accommodation, not a fundamental impairment to parenting capacity. She walks independently for the vast majority of daily activities, using a cane primarily for extended distances or fatigue management. Her independent functional capacity evaluation specifically concludes that her physical status presents no significant barrier to safe, consistent, adequate parenting." Then Diane moved to the documentation regarding actual parental involvement, and this is where I watched the courtroom's energy shift in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. "I'd like to present documentation regarding the actual pattern of involvement by each parent over the past 4 years, Diane said, distributing organized binders to both the judge and opposing counsel. "This documentation includes confirmed visitation records, text message communications regarding scheduling, and school and medical attendance records for the minor child." What followed was perhaps 45 minutes of methodical, devastating presentation of exactly the contrast Diane had spent months building. School records showing my consistent attendance at every parent-teacher conference, every school event, contrasted with records showing Marcus's attendance at none of these same events. Medical appointment records showing my presence at every pediatric checkup, every vaccination, every minor illness visit, contrasted with Marcus's absence from all of them. The text message documentation proved particularly damning. Diane walked through specific examples, confirmed visitation dates followed by Marcus's cancellation messages, often with minimal advance notice, citing reasons that, when totaled across 4 years, painted a consistent pattern of prioritization that placed his daughter reliably below work commitments, scheduling conflicts, and what frequently appeared to be simple disinterest. Across the 4 years since the parties' divorce, Diane stated, the documented record shows Mr. Chen exercising visitation with his daughter on 31 confirmed occasions, totaling approximately 93 hours of direct contact time. By comparison, Ms. Chen has provided full-time primary care for the minor child for over 17,000 hours during this same period, while simultaneously completing extensive physical rehabilitation and maintaining stable, full-time professional employment. I watched Marcus's expression during this presentation, the particular discomfort of someone watching a carefully constructed narrative collapse under the weight of documented reality. His attorney attempted several objections regarding the relevance and characterization of this evidence, most of which Judge Hendricks allowed to stand, noting that established patterns of parental involvement were directly relevant to custody determinations. Jennifer testified next, describing in careful, specific detail the actual texture of those first crucial months, my struggle to learn basic mobility while caring for a newborn, Marcus's near-complete absence during the period when his support would have mattered most, the genuine difficulty of those early days that I had navigated, ultimately successfully, with family support rather than the partnership a marriage theoretically promised. I watched my sister learn to walk again while caring for an infant almost entirely alone, Jennifer testified, her voice carrying genuine emotion that felt, in that formal courtroom setting, both vulnerable and powerful. She never once treated her recovery as an excuse to disengage from Emma's needs. She showed up, every single day, despite genuine physical pain and exhaustion that I witnessed directly. Marcus, during this same period, called occasionally, visited rarely, and when he did visit, often seemed uncomfortable and eager to leave. Carol, my physical therapist, provided similarly compelling testimony about my actual functional capacity, explicitly countering any suggestion that my mobility limitations created genuine risk or instability for childcare responsibilities. When Marcus finally took the stand himself, his attorney attempted to rehabilitate the narrative of an engaged, well-intentioned father facing obstacles beyond his control. Mr. Chan, his attorney asked, "Can you explain to the court why your visitation with your daughter has been less frequent than perhaps you would have liked over these past 4 years?" Marcus's answer, when it came, revealed something that I think genuinely surprised even his own legal team, given the visible flash of concern on his attorney's face as he spoke. "I think, honestly, I struggled with the whole situation," Marcus said. Watching Rachel go through her recovery, knowing I'd left during such a difficult time, it brought up a lot of guilt that made visits genuinely uncomfortable for me. I know that's not a great excuse, but it's the truth. Diane, during cross-examination, pursued this admission with precise, methodical questions that further undermined his attorney's carefully constructed narrative. "Mr. Chan," she asked, "you've testified that visits felt uncomfortable due to guilt regarding your departure during your wife's recovery. Can you clarify, then, why you're currently seeking primary custody, given that this same guilt presumably hasn't motivated more consistent involvement over the past 4 years?" Marcus hesitated visibly before answering. I think I want to be more involved now. Emma's older, things feel different." "Different in what way?" Diane pressed. "Different because Ms. Chun has successfully completed an extraordinary physical recovery that you predicted, during your departure conversation, might never happen. Different because the daily, difficult work of single parenting through that recovery has already been completed by someone else, making consistent involvement considerably easier to manage now than it would have been during those earlier, more challenging years." Marcus didn't have an adequate response to this question, and his visible discomfort, his inability to articulate a coherent justification beyond vague references to wanting to be more involved, seemed to crystallize, for the court, exactly the pattern Diane had spent the entire proceeding methodically documenting. Judge Hendricks's ruling, delivered after a recess of approximately 90 minutes, was unambiguous in its conclusions. "The court finds," she stated, "that the petitioner has failed to demonstrate any legitimate concern regarding the respondent's parenting capacity related to her physical condition. The medical evidence presented establishes clearly that Ms. Chen's mobility limitations do not constitute a barrier to safe, adequate, or consistent parenting. Furthermore, the documented pattern of parental involvement over the past 4 years demonstrates that Ms. Chen has provided the overwhelming majority of direct care, emotional support, and developmental guidance for the minor child, while Mr. Chen's involvement has been markedly inconsistent and minimal by his own choice, not due to any obstacle presented by Ms. Chen." She continued, addressing directly what I think mattered most about this entire proceeding. "The court is particularly troubled by the apparent strategy of citing physical disability, successfully overcome through extensive rehabilitation and personal determination, as evidence of parental unfitness. This characterization not only misrepresents the actual medical evidence, but reflects a concerning pattern of viewing disability recovery as inherently disqualifying for parenting responsibilities, a perspective this court explicitly rejects as both factually incorrect and legally untenable. The existing custody arrangement, with primary physical custody remaining with me and standard visitation rights for Marcus, was upheld in full, with Judge Hendricks specifically noting that any future modification would require demonstrated, sustained, consistent involvement over an extended period rather than the kind of strategic, litigation-timed engagement that had characterized Marcus's recent behavior. I left that courtroom with Diane, both of us emotionally drained but carrying the particular satisfaction of vindication that comes after months of meticulous, exhausting preparation finally proving sufficient against an attempt to weaponize my hardest, most difficult years against me. In the parking lot, Emma's school called my cell phone with a question about an upcoming field trip permission form, a perfectly mundane interruption that felt, somehow, like exactly the right reminder of what actually mattered amid everything that had just happened in that courtroom. I drove to pick up Emma from her after-school program, watching her run toward my car with the easy, uncomplicated joy of a 4-year-old whose entire understanding of family had never included anything other than what we'd actually built together, a mother who showed up, consistently, despite challenges that an entire legal proceeding had just spent hours examining, and a father whose presence had always been occasional, unpredictable, ultimately unreliable in ways that Emma, at 4 years old, was only beginning to understand. "How was school?" I asked, helping her into her car seat with the easy, practiced movements that 4 years of recovery had eventually restored. "Good," she said. "We made turkeys for Thanksgiving." Mine has googly eyes. I drove home that evening thinking about the particular irony of Marcus's entire legal strategy, that the very recovery he'd predicted during our final conversation in that rehabilitation facility might never happen. The recovery he'd cited as justification for abandoning his disabled wife and newborn daughter had become, for years later, the foundation of his attempt to take that same daughter away entirely. He had left because he couldn't envision a future where I might never walk again. I had walked again. I had rebuilt a complete, stable, genuinely happy life for Emma and myself, against odds that doctors had initially characterized as deeply uncertain. And when that recovery proved more complete than Marcus had apparently anticipated when he made his decision to leave, when the daily, difficult work of raising Emma through those hardest years had already been accomplished by someone else, he'd attempted to weaponize the very limitation he'd once cited as unbearable, framing my successful recovery as ongoing evidence of incapacity rather than what it actually represented, extraordinary, sustained determination through years of genuine hardship that he had chosen not to share. The court saw through that strategy clearly. But I think, more importantly, for years of consistent, daily presence had already built something between Emma and me that no courtroom proceeding, however contentious, could have actually threatened, a foundation of security and trust built through thousands of ordinary days, rather than the occasional, strategic visits that had characterized her father's involvement. If you've ever had your hardest struggles, your most difficult recovery, weaponized against you by someone who abandoned you during exactly the time you needed support most, I hope this story reminds you that consistency, documentation, and your own daily presence in the lives of people who depend on you matter more than any narrative someone else might try to construct after the fact. Leave a comment if this story resonated with you. Tell me about a time your own resilience became the very thing someone tried to use against you. Subscribe if you want to stay. There are more stories like this one waiting.